February 19th, 1945, 0611 Centene hours, northern edge of Iwo Jima's Motoyama Plateau. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka of the 26th Tank Regiment crouched inside the open hatch of his Type 97 Shinhoto Chiha, the metal cold against his gloves as he studied the southern shoreline through a narrow, jagged depression in the black volcanic rock. Below him, barely visible in the morning haze, the first waves of American landing craft were already scraping across the surf. His regiment, roughly 28 operational tanks out of the 600 originally assigned to defend the entire Bonin Islands chain, was dug into hardened volcanic bunkers and camouflaged hull pits carved directly into the slopes. Tanaka had been ordered not to maneuver, not to countercharge, not to reveal his position. But as he watched the American fleet spread across the horizon, he felt the old instinct rising. Tanks existed to move, to strike, to outflank. Yet on Iwo Jima, they were being used as underground artillery pieces. At Tsuro 6:20 hours, distant flashes rippled across the sea. Tanaka glanced instinctively toward the western horizon and saw something he had only witnessed once before at Saipan, but never at this scale. A row of massive silhouettes, USS North Carolina, USS Indianapolis, USS Pensacola, and a half dozen others, opened up, their 16-inch and 8-inch naval rifles unleashing synchronized fire. The first shells screamed overhead, dragging long thunderclaps behind them. Tanaka ducked automatically, though the rounds were aimed at the beaches far to the south. The ground shook as if struck by earthquakes. Red dust and volcanic ash rose in violent plumes drifting northward on the wind. He felt a chill crawl across his spine. These were not high-angle artillery shells. These were armor-piercing rounds weighing as much as 1,000 kilograms, moving faster than anything his tanks, or any tank on Earth, could withstand. Even from 8 miles offshore, the American guns were outranging every weapon the Japanese had on the island. Their shells hit with such force that the bunker walls around Tanaka trembled. In the distance, he saw a Chiha turret, buried in defilade, its gun trained toward the beach, shudder violently as a shock wave washed across the ridge. It had not even been hit, but the concussion alone shattered its mantle welds. At 06:28 hours, a new sound cut across the volcanic plateau, a sharper, faster shriek. This time the shells did not land by the beach. A column of volcanic ash leapt upward less than 700 meters from Tanaka's tank. He grabbed the periscope handles, turned, and saw the source. American destroyers and cruisers had begun adjusting fire inland. Their spotting aircraft, tiny specks looping high above the ridge, were marking targets for demolition. Japanese artillery positions, tunnels, supply caches, even suspected tank emplacements were being zeroed in one by one. The Americans had not yet set foot on the Motoyama high ground, but their naval guns were reaching into the island's heart. Tanaka's radio operator called out sharply as another impact shook the northern slope. Direct hit. Position 4 bunker. Chiha disabled. Disabled was a polite word. Through the drifting haze, Tanaka saw the wreck clearly. The American shell had landed at least 20 meters away, yet it had blown the ordnance hatch off the tank, collapsing its firing chamber and crushing the turret ring. His mind struggled with the implications. Naval guns, firing from miles offshore, had neutralized a tank that was underground, stationary, camouflaged, and protected by hardened volcanic strata. He had expected naval gunfire. He had not expected it to be this accurate, this sustained, this brutally effective. The Americans were reaching into terrain previously considered immune to naval bombardment. They were stripping away the island's armor, not with tanks, but with warships. And in that moment, as another shell detonated so close that his periscope lenses rattled in their mounts, Tanaka realized something he had never accepted until that morning. The battlefield on Iwo Jima was not controlled by tanks or infantry or even artillery. It was controlled by the sea. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka had begun his military career in 1937, fresh from officer school, assigned first to the 4th Tank Regiment in China. He fought in the flat plains of Hebei, where Japanese tank doctrine still emphasized mobility, infantry support, and aggressive flanking against lightly equipped opponents. His early battles reinforced the same fundamental lesson that had guided the Imperial Japanese Army's tank arm for years. Maneuver and shock were decisive. Armor was a spearhead, a weapon of initiative, not a static tool. But by 1943, when Tanaka was transferred to the Bonin Islands, the strategic shape of the war had changed. Japanese tanks were no longer spearheads. They were last-line defenders against an industrial superpower, capable of projecting naval and air force concentrations across entire oceans. Tanaka's new posting was the 26th Tank Regiment, entrusted with the defense of Iwo Jima and the surrounding islands. His regiment's equipment was typical of the late-war Japanese armored forces. Type 95, Hago light tanks, Type 97, Chiha mediums, and a handful of the improved Shinhoto Chiha variants armed with the high-velocity 40-70mm gun. Against American M4 Shermans, they were marginal. Against naval gunfire, they were meaningless, yet none of this was obvious in 1943. When Tanaka first arrived on Iwo Jima, the island felt remote, untouched, and strangely secure. The airfields of Motoyama provided staging grounds for long-range reconnaissance aircraft. Japanese engineers spent months reinforcing tunnels, constructing hundreds of pillboxes, and digging miles of underground galleries that ran beneath the volcanic ridges. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived in mid-1944 and began transforming the island's defenses, insisting that every inch of ground be layered with interlocking fire zones. He forbade suicidal banzai charges. He demanded that tank crews use their vehicles as concealed guns rather than mobile armor. This philosophy frustrated Tanaka deeply. He had trained his crews for mobile warfare. He respected the Chiha's agility and its ability to exploit broken lines. But Kuribayashi saw the island differently. Iwo Jima offered no maneuver space, only killing grounds. The Americans would land with overwhelming numbers, supported by battleship-level firepower, and would advance methodically. Japanese armor would not survive long in the open. Therefore, Kuribayashi insisted, the tanks would be buried. And so Tanaka's regiment began operating in ways no tank officer truly wished to practice. They dug hull pits into the volcanic terrain, burying tanks up to their turrets. Many Chihas had their engines removed to reduce heat signatures and fuel consumption. Some were converted into stationary gun positions, immovable, but capable of delivering precise fire when the enemy drew near. Others were concealed within caves with carefully engineered embrasures. The regiment was slowly dissolving into the island itself, becoming a network of armored firing points rather than a maneuvering force. Through the summer of 1944, naval bombardments occasionally struck Iwo Jima, but only intermittently. Tanaka observed how easily pre-sighted American cruisers could drop shells onto fixed positions. Yet the bombardments were always brief. No one imagined the Americans would commit weeks of firepower to pulverizing an island only 8 square miles in area. But as the American advance through the Marianas tightened the strategic ring, Tanaka felt the shift. Radar stations on Iwo Jima became prime targets for American raids. Airfields that had once supported Japanese patrols now came under daily reconnaissance runs by P-38s and carrier-based Hellcats. Supplies from mainland Japan dwindled. Fuel reserves for his tanks were slashed repeatedly. The once formidable regiment, nominally hundreds of armored vehicles strong, now counted fewer than 40 tanks able to move under their own power. Throughout 1944, American submarine attacks further severed Japan's lines of communication. Convoys carrying ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts were sunk before reaching the Bonin Islands. Engineers struggled to maintain the tanks with improvised materials. Tracks were patched with rehammered steel, breaches repaired with welded scrap, and optics cleaned with rags soaked in recycled oil. For Tanaka, the war was becoming a struggle not against the enemy he saw, but against the enemy he never saw. The vast American industrial machine capable of sending submarines, carriers, cruisers, and supply ships thousands of kilometers into Japanese waters with relentless consistency. By the late autumn of 1944, Kuribayashi's defensive plan was finalized. The Japanese would not contest the beaches. They would wait, hours, perhaps days, for the Americans to move inland, where umbrellas of naval gunfire would provide less immediate support. Tanaka's tank regiment would remain silent, concealed, and immobile until the order was given to strike at the American flanks from underground positions. The tanks, he was told, were to be used like heavy artillery embedded within the terrain. January 1945 brought profound confirmation that the Americans were coming. Photographic reconnaissance grew constant. Carrier task forces circled the island. Submarines prowled around the volcanic promontories. And on February 16th, the American bombardment began. Tanaka was stunned by its intensity. The battleship USS Idaho fired over 500 rounds of 14-inch shells in the first day alone. Tennessee, California, New York, Nevada, and multiple cruisers added thousands more shells to the bombardment. Volcanic ridges that had stood unchanged since ancient times were carved into new shapes within hours. Entire tunnel entrances collapsed. Observational outposts vanished under landslides. Even deep bunkers, those dug meters below the surface, shuddered under the concussions. Tanaka's tanks, buried within these ridges, survived the bombardment better than expected. Naval gunfire was precise, but Iwo Jima's terrain absorbed shock like a sponge. Even so, several hull pits collapsed entirely, sealing tanks inside. Fuel lines ruptured, optics cracked. The psychological toll on the crews was immense. Every man knew that if a major caliber naval shell struck their direct location, the tank would cease to exist instantly, buried or not. On the morning of the February 19th, the bombardment intensified again just as the Americans prepared to land. Tanaka climbed into his turret and felt the ground tremble with each blast. He knew that the Americans were not firing at random. They were following aerial spotting instructions transmitted from amphibious aircraft circling overhead. Their ability to adjust fire into real time meant that even hardened tank positions could be targeted once identified. Then he saw it, the first direct proof of what American naval guns could truly do. A Cheehaw position, dug exactly like his own, was struck by a near miss. The sheer pressure differential tore the turret hatch off and bent the steel plating as though it were paper. The tank had not even been hit. It had simply been in the radius of destruction. Tanaka gripped the periscope. His hands trembled. Naval guns, firing from ships he could barely see, were shredding armor designed to withstand anti-tank guns at 500 meters. What chance would any tank have once the Americans reached the plateau? As the first waves of landing craft touched the sands of Iwo Jima, Tanaka finally understood the truth Kuribayashi had foreseen months earlier. Japan did not control Iwo Jima. Japan did not even contest it. The island was already inside the envelope of American naval power, reduced by guns, so large and numerous that even the strongest fortifications existed at their mercy. His tanks were about to face not the enemy in front of them, but the enemy offshore, and the Americans had enough shells, ships, and fire control systems to crush everything he commanded. The American landing had begun scarcely an hour earlier when Tanaka realized the naval bombardment had not ended. It had only shifted. By 07:45 hours, the great guns that had pulverized the beaches began to redirect their fire inland, following radio requests from marine forward observers who were now pushing cautiously off the black sand terraces at the water's edge. The Americans were not waiting to secure the beaches before calling fire. They were driving the bombardment ahead of their infantry like an invisible plow. Tanaka, watching from his concealed pit near Motoyama Plateau, heard the shift before he saw it. The tone of the explosions changed, less distant, more concussive. The shells that had pounded Mount Suribachi were now walking slowly northward, toward the very ridges where his tanks lay buried. He gripped the cold steel periscope handle, feeling the tremor of each blast through the volcanic earth. His crew sat motionless, sweat forming despite the morning cold, waiting for the moment when the bombardment reached their line. At 07:04 hours, the first spotting round landed. It detonated 200 meters downslope, throwing a cloud of ash and obsidian shards into the air. The sound reached the tank less than a second later, a sharp crack followed by the groaning of the ground. Tanaka recognized the signature, an 8-inch round, probably from USS Portland or USS Chicago. It was not yet on target, but it was close enough for the fire control teams offshore to begin adjusting. He wiped condensation from the periscope lens and refocused. Below, the Marines were advancing more slowly than expected, slowed by the soft volcanic sand and perfectly sighted machine gun pits hidden in the dunes. But they were advancing nonetheless, supported by Sherman tanks, landing in third and fourth waves. A group of vehicles, likely from the 4th Marine Division, began pushing toward the first rise, firing their 75 melee guns at suspected bunkers. Tanaka's heart tightened. His regiment had been instructed not to fire until American armor approached within 300 meters. But to allow these Shermans to advance unopposed seemed unbearable. At 08:09 hours, the next naval salvo arrived. This time it struck the ridgeline itself. The first shell hit 90 meters from Tanaka's position. The shock traveled through the volcanic ash like a living force. Fine dust rained from the ceiling of the tank pit. The second shell landed even closer. Tanaka felt the armor beneath him vibrate as though it were made of thin ceramic instead of steel. He shouted to his crew to clamp down all loose equipment. By 08:13 hours, American spotters had locked onto the general location of the Japanese armor. Emplacements. They had not identified exact tank positions, those were too well hidden, but they had confirmed where the defensive line must be. That was enough. Cruisers shifted to sustained fire using patterns designed to collapse underground positions by impact shock rather than direct hits. Tanaka knew the technique well. His regiment had drilled in Manchuria to resist Russian artillery. But those drills had never imagined a shell weighing nearly 1,000 kilograms detonating close enough to lift the tank bodily off the ground. A flash, a void, a noise like the unzipping of the sky. A 14-inch round from USS Pennsylvania struck the slope 30 meters upslope of Tanaka. The blast ripped open the ground, carving a crater so large it swallowed half a dozen trees and sent a plume of black dust rising 400 feet. The concussion forced the Cheeha's suspension downward, then rebounded. Dust filled the tank interior. Tanaka tried breathing through a cloth. The air tasted metallic, volcanic, suffocating. His gunner shouted, "Turret ring jammed!" The blast had warped the collar fractionally, enough to grind rotation nearly to a halt. Tanaka cursed softly. Naval fire was disabling their tanks without touching them. A second blast landed downslope. The entire ridge seemed to split. Tanaka thought his tank had been physically pushed backward, though he knew it was only the shock wave. Through the periscope, he saw the aftermath more clearly. Another Cheehaw hull, partially buried like his own, now lay sagging into its pit. Its turret had collapsed inward, crushed by pressure like a squeezed fruit. No shell had hit it directly. It was 08:20 hours. His regiment had not yet fired a shot, and already more than a third of its armor was ruined. More shells came. At 08:34 hours, a 16-inch displacement round from North Carolina slammed into the volcanic slope half a kilometer away. But even at that distance, Tanaka felt its arrival through the soles of his boots. The crater that followed was nearly 20 meters across, glowing red at the edges from heat. The Americans were systematically stripping the plateau of anything resembling a hardened position, and still their infantry advanced. By 08:45 hours, the 1st Marine Sherman reached the foot of the ridge. It fired a white phosphorus round that splashed across a Japanese machine gun nest, forcing the surviving defenders into tunnels. Tanaka watched the Sherman pivot slightly, adjusting its aim. He knew the moment to reveal his tank was approaching. He hissed for silence, stabilizing his breathing. "Stand by the gun," he told his crew, when they reached 200 meters. But before he could engage, the naval bombardment resumed with a terrifying new accuracy. At 08:52 hours, marked rounds began landing in a deliberate staircase pattern that moved up the slope in 30-meter increments. Someone offshore, likely using an air spotter, was walking the fire into the exact zone where Japanese tanks were, known to be buried. Tanaka understood instantly. They were no longer being shelled blindly. They were being hunted. The next shell landed so close that Tanaka lost vision momentarily. Dust filled the air. Something metallic clattered inside the turret, a shattered weld, perhaps a loose mounting bracket. A second shell followed. The embrasure protecting the tank's gun barrel shook violently. The crew braced themselves against the walls. Then came the third. Smoke drifted up from the tank's suspension. A faint crack appeared along one weld seam. The Chiha was not hit, not directly, but it was dying. Tanaka forced himself to look through the periscope again. What he saw was impossible. American destroyers, USS Wedderburn, USS Bryant, and others were steaming closer than before, perhaps less than 7,000 meters from the shore. They were firing flat trajectory 5-inch rounds directly into suspected Japanese armor pits. One after another, impacts tore into the volcanic crust. Smaller guns than those on the battleships, yes, but far more precise. And at such close range, they were devastating. One shell landed almost exactly at the aperture of a Chiha firing slit. The blast punched into the opening, vaporizing the gun shield and sending a blast of molten steel backward into the crew. The tank erupted from within like a volcano, smoke pouring from its own pit. Tanaka felt his stomach twist. Naval gunfire was entering confined spaces that no field artillery could hope to strike. A Japanese spotter, hidden in a tunnel above the tank emplacements, transmitted a chaotic message over radio. "Enemy naval guns, point fire, point fire. Tanks cannot." The transmission ended mid-sentence. By 09:05 hours, American Marines began moving up the slope again, Shermans forming a wedge ahead of them. Tanaka realized that if he did not act now, he would be buried alive. He gritted his teeth and ordered the driver, "Forward, full throttle." The Chiha lurched upward out of its pit. Loose rock slid away from the treads. For a brief moment, Tanaka felt the familiar surge of mobility, the one thing a tank was built to do. But the turret still dragged from its jammed ring. He could rotate only a few degrees at a time. The first Sherman appeared between pillars of volcanic ash at a range of 190 meters. Tanaka ordered, "Fire!" The gun barked. The 47 mm round exploded against the Sherman's glacis, but it bounced, only leaving a scorch mark. He fired again, another ricochet. The Sherman answered immediately with a 75 mm shell. It struck the ground near Tanaka's right tread and ripped open the suspension. The tank heaved, nearly throwing him from the hatch. He ducked back inside as another round slammed into the flank. Steel screeched. The driver cried out. But even as the Shermans fired, the naval guns resumed. At 09:02 hours, a 5-inch shell struck the earth immediately behind Tanaka's tank and detonated beneath the engine deck. The blast punched upward, lifting the Chiha off its suspension and slamming it down sideways. Flames burst from the engine compartment. The turret ring cracked fully. The gunner slumped against the breech. Tanaka tried to open the hatch, but heat blasted him back. He called for his crew. No response. Smoke filled the turret. The tank was burning. He realized with sudden clarity, it had not been the Shermans that killed his tank. It had been the naval guns. They had softened the ridge, cracked the armor, weakened every weld, crippled every mechanism. His Chiha had been dead before it ever fired. He forced himself through the hatch, rolling out onto the volcanic slope. The tank behind him bloomed into flame. Shells, American naval shells, continued to tear into the hillside, blasting apart what remained of the tank regiment he had spent years training. By 09:30 hours, the battle for this plateau had collapsed into chaos. Marine riflemen advanced behind the tanks, firing at cave entrances. Engineers threw satchel charges into tank pits already half filled with volcanic ash. More naval salvos boomed in the distance. wrecking every defensive position that showed the slightest sign of life. Tanaka limped toward a tunnel entrance, coughing, half blinded by smoke. He turned once more to look at the burning remains of his regiment, hulks of Chihas shattered not by anti-tank guns, but by fire directed from miles offshore. He understood the truth now with unshakable finality. Japan's tanks had never stood a chance on this island, not against Marines, not against Shermans, and certainly not against a navy that could reach into hardened bunkers with guns so powerful that even a near miss was fatal. It was not a battle between armor and armor. It was a battle between armor and the industrial power of an ocean-spanning fleet. No tank commander, no matter how skilled, could survive that equation. Thank you for watching this World War II story. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.